Before we jump on the flight deck, let's first give you an overview of what steps you'll take during a visual approach. This procedure will go too quick to lay out the steps in sufficient detail while it's happening. As you approach the airport, you will be on what's called a downwind leg and 2 miles from the airport. This means the airport will be 2 miles off to your side, and you will be parallel to the airport, headed opposite of the landing direction. When you enter this downwind leg, you'll get to flaps 1 plus 10 knots to begin the slowdown. Additionally, you'll be at 1,500 feet AGL. When you come abeam the runway numbers, the numbers of the runway you are intending to use, you will get to flaps 10 plus 10 knots to slow down even more. To meet a 0.2 or 2.5 miles from the runway, you must turn on a base. Before we turn base, we are going to do a couple things. First, you'll turn off the autopilot and fly the aircraft all on your own. Next, you'll put down the gear and get to flaps 20 plus 10 knots. Finally, you'll arm the speed brake and descend as needed. Now that you've got those steps down, you can do the turn to that point. This is going to be a heavy turn and will most likely require a lot of effort on your part. When you are established on the base leg, get to final landing flaps and landing speed. The last turn on final, like the turn before, requires a lot of effort. If you aren't pulling back on the stick while you turn, you'll sink like a rock. At this stage, you're watching your altitude, so you cross that point at 500 to 700 feet. Once you get to the point at an acceptable altitude, you can start adjusting your descent rate so you get on the glide slope. This is where it takes some experience to fly the approach well. You'll have to get used to landing the aircraft visually, as you are in full control. Now, I know a lot of you guys just like to throw the bird on autoland every time and have it take the aircraft in. If you do this, most of your procedures section is an absolute waste. This knowledge is here for a reason. There is nothing more satisfying in life than successfully completing something that is challenging. Flying is no different. The airbag checklist has already been done for you, and the only thing you'll need to do is turn some knobs and hand fly the aircraft into the famous Princess Juliana International, known for its beachside runway. We're first going to play with our heading tools a bit. First, press heading hold. This way we can turn the heading select knob and enter in our desired heading before we turn. Just get the dashed magenta line parallel with the runway. Also, remember that this downwind is to be 2 miles from the runway. Use the scale on your ND to guesstimate where you need to be and make the judgment call as to when you want to turn. While you make this turn, get to flaps 1 plus 10 knots. You know the drill, so there is no need to explain that further. We are turning in now at 1,500 feet AGL, and I'd say about 2.5 miles from the runway. Basically, what we are doing here with the heading tools is building a square course in which to perform the visual approach by connecting a series of 90-degree turns. It's certainly not the most precise way of doing things, but in the end it works out well. Plus, this way we don't have to be looking out the window constantly, as the instruments actually assist us in the process. Once you straighten out on your heading, press heading hold again. Now you can use your dash magenta line as a reference to where we are. As you see on the ND, the dash magenta line is 90 degrees our right. We are parallel to the runway, on the downwind leg, and flying opposite the landing direction. Now we just need to get abeam the runway numbers. The dash magenta line will tell us exactly when we're there. As we get abeam, go ahead and get to flaps 10 plus 10 knots. For a few moments now, we simply wait for the aircraft to slow down before we get to the next step. This is where it's very important that you bleed off that extra airspeed. This approach is unlike the other approaches, where you had ample time to slow down. Visual approaches are the fastest approach you will perform, as well as the most aggressive on the aircraft itself. You'll notice that as we do slow down and bring in those flaps, a couple things happen. First, our pitch begins to increase so we can maintain that altitude, and second, once we do get to our speed, it takes a lot more thrust to maintain level flight. Alright, it's about time to turn on base. Get to flaps 20 plus 10 knots and put down the gear. This is really going to feel like you're slamming on the brakes.
Goose, I'm gonna slam on the brakes and I'll fly right by.
Name that movie. Once you do these steps, disconnect the autopilot and begin to turn inbound. As I mentioned, these turns will be sharp and will require a lot of effort to keep the aircraft from sinking. We still want to be at our altitude of 1500 at this stage. Keep the turn coming around and keep it coordinated. This means that you'll be matching up the sailboat, which was discussed in the PFD section, to make sure the aircraft is performing to its top ability in the turn. It can't be said enough that you'll also need a lot of back pressure on the yoke in this turn. At this low speed and landing configuration, the aircraft wants to drop like a rock when it loses all that lift during a turn. Don't be fooled, it will take a lot of effort on your part. Once you think it's time to start rolling out on that turn to level off the wings on the base, go ahead and do so. When you get level, get to your final landing configuration. That is flaps 30 plus any wind. Today will be at an even 140. Continue to watch that altitude and make sure it doesn't slip too much. Admittedly, I lost a bit in that turn, but at the same time, I was really fighting the aircraft. If you lose a bit of altitude, no worries. But if you drop more than 150 or 200 feet in the turn, then do a better job next time. If you get too low too soon, you'll be on a very shallow glide slope to meet the runway. That's not what we want. We want our standard 3-degree glide slope. Check the runway and determine on your own when it's time to turn. This will only come with experience. Remember that the tighter the turn you want, the greater the bank angle you'll need. You can also use the trend vector to see where the aircraft will be. When I'm hand flying the aircraft and shooting for a specific course on the ND, I give a lot of attention to the trend vector. This shows us in real time where you'll be, then you can adjust accordingly. Once you get that turn established, you can start to let that altitude come down. I could let the altitude sink a bit more during the turn, but I'm always cautious about how much I'll let it drop down during a turn. Right now I'd say we're slightly high based on where we should be. As we roll the aircraft out to line up on final, you can see that we have 3 whites and 1 red. This means we're slightly high. We must now increase our descent rate slightly and continue to get on track with that runway. It'll almost take constant input from you, the pilot, to stay on track. It's better to get things smooth early. Otherwise, the more difficult it'll become as you get closer to the runway. I know you want to skim that fence and send all the tourists ducking. Just concentrate on the approach. Later, you can learn how to skim fences on your own time. The rest of the approach is the same as the others. You want to stay on that nice glide slope and on centerline. I could have done a bit better job at lining up with the runway early on, but as it stands now, we're on glide slope, on centerline, and the landing environment is coming up on us very quickly. At this stage, focus on 3 things: descent rate, centerline, and glide slope. Any adjustments needed will have to be small, quick, and commanding. This is where the approach can get away from you very fast. As the ground starts to come up at you, don't get scared and pull up. Keep that descent rate where it's been, which is right on glide slope.
100.
At 50 feet, disconnect auto throttle, flare at 30 to 20 feet,
10.
and settle the landing gear down. Bring in reverse thrust when you meet terra firma. This isn't the longest runway, so we don't have the luxury of floating or going easy on the brakes. At 80 knots, bring in reverse thrust and prepare to do a tight turn on this runway without a high-speed exit taxiway.